This episode of the History Guy is brought to you by Coveron. Coveron protects you from phishing, fraud, and online scams. Most of us are familiar with the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which was founded by Puritans in 1630, but much less well known is the fact that Massachusetts Bay wasn't the only place where the Puritans tried to establish a religious utopia in the Americas. In the early part of the 17th century, English Puritans established what they hoped would be a model colony on an obscure Caribbean island. The results were not what they would have hoped. The forgotten Providence Island colony deserves to be remembered. Throughout history, whenever military engineers figured out how to build stronger walls, then eventually the attackers would simply come up with better siege weapons as a way to breach them. The real key isn't assuming that your walls are ever going to be 100% unbreakable. It's coming up with a plan to recover and rebuild when a breach occurs. And today's digital landscape works pretty much the same way. We rely on password managers and bank alerts as sort of our castle walls, but today's scammers use AI to craft messages that sound like they come from your bank or your workplace or your delivery service, and they don't have the typos or obvious red flags. FTC and FBI records show that Americans lost nearly $21 billion to cybercrime in 2025 alone. Most security tools, they only give you an alert after your money's already gone, but then they leave it to you to clean up that mess alone. But I always say that tools reduce risk, but insurance reduces loss. And that's where Coveron comes in. Coveron is a complete digital protection ecosystem that combines dark web monitoring and credit alerts with real financial recovery, up to $2 million in identity theft recovery for legal fees and lost wages, up to $10,000 for direct losses due to scams or online fraud, up to $50,000 for cyber extortion protection, and up to $25,000 for home title insurance. And best of all, you don't have to fight alone. Coveron connects you to real experts who will guide you step by step through recovering your identity. So protect your money, your identity, your time. Go to coveron.com/thehistory and use code thehistory, or use the link that's at the top of the description or in the pinned comment or the handy QR code, and then use my coupon code and get an exclusive discount on Coveron. It's completely risk-free with a 30-day money-back guarantee. The 16th and 17th centuries saw considerable conflict between Catholics and Protestants. Spain, the most powerful Catholic state, was rich from its American colonies, driving war throughout Europe. England was a special case, ostensibly Protestant after splitting in 1534. The Anglican Church was in many ways still Catholic in character. Puritans and other separatists felt that the reform had not gone far enough, a disagreement that would lead to King Charles being overthrown in the English Civil War in the 1640s. For many Puritans, dissatisfaction and persecution led them to immigrate to the New World, but high-ranking Puritans saw the flight as something of a betrayal. John Cotton, who immigrated to Boston and was the grandfather of Cotton Mather, wrote that they were accused of fleeing like mice from a crumbling house, anticipating its ruin, and treacherously giving up the defense of the common cause of the Reformation. Puritan leaders were prominent in Parliament in the 1620s, and they saw troubling signs everywhere. Part of their complaint was with King Charles, who had Catholic advisors and a Catholic wife, and supported Arminianism over Calvinism, which the Puritans saw as an attempt to bring in popery, little by little. Charles also sought peace with the enemy, Spain. Puritan preachers saw England as weak, unwilling or unable to assist the Protestant cause on the continent, then engaged in the brutal 30 Years' War. They saw the hard times of the 1620s, with resurgent plague, poverty, and harvest failure, as evidence that God was withdrawing his favor from England. According to Karen Ordall Kupperman, author of Providence Island, 1630 to 1641, the other Puritan colony, they hoped to advance English interests so that England could stand against Catholicism. Puritan leaders saw war with Spain as a way to siphon riches to England. In 1626, several leading Puritan politicians put forward a proposal for a West Indies company that would have taken the war to the Spanish colonies to weaken Spain's war effort in Europe. In 1628, English privateers acting out of Bermuda discovered an island, Santa Catalina. One of the privateers, Daniel Elfrith, returned to Bermuda, where his son in law, Governor Philip Bell, wrote a letter to England arguing for colonizing the island. It was, Bell said, in the heart of the Indies and the mouth of the Spaniards. Bell was sure that the island, properly fortified, would be invincible. Providence Island, as it would come to be known, is a volcanic island with a peak 1,100 feet high, from which rather fantastically formed spines offer fertile land in valleys. It is also surrounded by coral reefs, making approach difficult. 1629 was a momentous year. That year, a truce between England and Spain came into force. Charles I dissolved Parliament, not to meet again for 11 years, and some of the leading Puritan politicians formed the Providence Island Company. Among the investors was John Pym, an influential politician, William Fiennes, the Viscount and Baron of Say and Seal, the Earls of Warwick and Holland, Lord Mandeville, and Lord Robarts. Bell was appointed the governor, captain general, and chief commander of the island, essentially the conduit between the island and the investors, and holding all of their power, though still nearly all important decisions needed to be relayed to London, subject to the investors' will. Armed with grandiose promises, the first settlers arrived with Bell from Bermuda on Christmas Eve, 1629. The first town was dubbed New Westminster, and Fort Warwick soon began construction under Samuel Axe. The company initially envisioned a relationship of total dependence on the settlers' part. They wouldn't own the land, but hold it at the pleasure of the company, according to Cupperman. The first ship full of settlers, the Seaflower, left England in February 1631. It was in 1632 that the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established with the arrival of Winthrop fleet with the help of the Earl of Warwick. Few in the Providence Island Company expected that cold, rocky land to be as successful as their paradise in the Caribbean. Almost all of the initial colonists were men who were discouraged from bringing their families. They were formed into artificial families that would encourage good Christian behavior and work the land. All settlers were also expected to help build defenses and serve in the militia. The investors hoped that they would find cash crops in vines, olives, oranges, citrons, sugarcane, and oil producing plants, but specifically, not tobacco. We fear nothing more than the earnest intending to plant tobacco thereby, to raise present commodity should, as it hath done in Bermuda and Virginia, cause you to neglect things necessary and useful. Better commodities might take longer to develop, but promise greater riches in the long run. As with most colonial pursuits, costs ballooned past expectations, but the investors were sure that the colony would soon be self supporting. Initial reports promised a land of great and excessive fertility. Bell claimed that this your little spot of land will throw one of the gardens of the world. The first minister, young Lewis Morgan, compared the island to the Eden of God. Bell also mentioned, however, a drought, and that tobacco was already growing, till we can be furnished with some better and more staple commodities. But in March 1632, the Seaflower finally returned to England, and the news was bad. The island already was essentially engaged in a revolt from the company government, and at the rebellion's head was Minister Lewis Morgan. The investors chose to arrange for Morgan's removal. The investors, already well in debt with expenses, were not interested in compromise with settlers who filled their letters with infamous libels directed at them. Perhaps, they wrote the settlers, they were not satisfied with the promise of that good land, like some of the Israelites in Israel. This gave God occasion to deprive them of the food land, and to let their carcasses fall in the wilderness, as men most unworthy. Settlers were expected to give half of their profits to the company. The investors promised that half of what one man can make in a year will be far greater profit to him than any man's handy labor can yield him in England in 7. The investors were willing to make some promises about the island's protection, which some colonists called unfortifiable. Most confusing to the investors was that the settlers resented having to spend time building the island's fortifications, instead demanding the company send servants to do that work. In an attempt to defray costs, the investors paid only the most necessary artisans in pounds sterling, promising the others only servants in land. But directing servants to the defenses deprived many of them of their promised pay. One of the most fundamental issues was that the settlers wanted longer leases or promises they would be allowed to keep the land if they worked it. They sent their second ship, called the Charity, with new settlers, including John Pym's stepbrother, Arthur Roos, as minister to replace Morgan. One of the greatest problems the island faced was that all decisions related to the company, which might undermine decisions made on the island, especially if those decisions impacted relatives or friends of company members. Almost as soon as the first colonists arrived, factionalization and friction between the leaders threatened the success of the enterprise. The company believed that the godly Puritans would not allow themselves to live in discord, an assumption that proved woefully naive. While Bell was governor, the captains, supposedly subordinate military leaders, exercised broad powers. Elfrith was in charge of the ships, while William Rudyard, younger brother of investor Sir Benjamin Rudyard, was muster master general. The captains freely used their positions to reward friends and allies and to give preferential access to supplies. The private dissensions and secret heartburnings, as the investors described it, split the council. The investors complained of a lack of information, but also of too much information when it concerned the shameful behavior of investors' kin. A committee was appointed to meet the returning ships and censor the records, that what is unfit may be taken away and the rest new written for company records. Rudyard and Morgan quarreled over some books lent to Morgan, but Rudyard's real complaint was that Lewis didn't respect him, his social better. Rudyard groused at Lewis's sluttish and unbeseeming message. "Know your foul mother" answer deserves rather sharp retribution. I've given you too much respect, Rudyard wrote. Rudyard in turn was charged with drunkenness, swearing, and ill carriage towards the governor. The investors decided that Rudyard had been unfairly singled out. His older brother thought William had been snappishly provoked. Rudyard would eventually be forced out of the colony when he had one of his servants beaten so badly that he died in an effort to prevent scurvy, which was believed to be brought on by laziness. In 1634, Bell suspended William Roots, John Pym's step-nephew, from the council. The investors publicly humiliated Bell with a sharp reproof. Captain Elfrith and Samuel Axe, who was in charge of building fortifications, fought just as often. Axe, whose expertise they could ill afford to lose, left the island to work on potential projects on the mainland rather than continentside. Investors asked him to return, provided only that for the honor of the government you make an acknowledgement of your former miscarriage, opposing the governor's orders. The fighting was bad enough that by 1634 the investors were looking for a replacement governor. But all of these problems were really nothing compared to the issue of finding a commodity that could recoup investment. Investors searched broadly. Palma Christi, the castor oil plant, could be useful in English textile production. The investors thought there was no fear of glutting by its quantity, nor meanness of price in its sale. They sent rhubarb, canary vines, black salsify, also known as viper's grass, wild potatoes, cotton, dye matter, and countless other plants. None of them took. The colonists complained of drought conditions and that other plants simply didn't flourish. They put perhaps their greatest hopes on a kind of silk grass from the mainland found by Sussex Cammock, which they called Cammock's flax. Copperman concludes that the flax was probably a bromeliad called Ishley, although other plants had been suggested. They even obtained a monopoly patent on its cultivation, but it would never be grown in large quantities. The island only ever produced tobacco in large quantities and not in high quality. The company refused to send more colonists or servants without an established crop, but the novice planters on the island had little hope of success. By 1633, the company was looking instead to establish trading centers on the coast to trade with the natives. They poured most of their energy into this new venture, and many important men from the island left to make it happen. Colonist Hope Sherrard complained that 50 of our ablest and skillfulest men were gone from us. To ease the shortage of workforce, Cammock was authorized to purchase slaves. Despite the ongoing issues, 1635 brought an even greater change. That year, the colonists were in disarray when the Spanish attempted to root out the English pirates. The Spanish attacked two islands, Tortuga, which had both French settlers and a small English settlement directed by the Providence Island Company, and Providence Island itself. The Spanish struck Tortuga first, destroying the French and English settlements there. Then they moved against Providence Island. The Spanish force arrived in July and anchored near New Westminster, where they demanded the settlement surrender. Governor Bell refused. Providence Island had to its north a smaller island connected to the main island by a tiny neck of land. The Spanish decided to strike on this neck, which appeared undefended. The English were able to drag their cannons within range and open fire on the Spanish as they tried to land, forcing the torn and battered ships to flee in haste and disorder. The successful defense offered the company an opportunity. immediately went to the king to authorize letters of marque against the Spanish. And after a report from the Secretary of State, John Coke, which emphasized the great cost of maintaining the defenses, their request was granted. Where industry had failed, piracy might succeed. And don't all good stories involve pirates? The very nature of the colony changed as men were put in charge of the ships. The colonists were expected to grow food primarily to supply the privateers. In addition, they chose to replace Governor Bell with Robert Hunt, sent in 1636. Hunt was an experienced soldier who had fought on the continent. Hunt would ultimately treat Bell badly, allowing his enemies to accuse him of all manner of crime and allowing men to testify against him without taking an oath. The investors were infuriated. Hunt was meant to soothe discord, not to inflame it. The shift frightened the planters, who knew that their lives were now in considerably greater danger. The captains quickly became the most significant power on the island. Hunt failed to end factionalism or strife on the island, and so in 1638, Nathaniel Butler, formerly governor of Bermuda, replaced Hunt as governor. Hunt was left as a captain, as were Samuel Axe and Andrew Carter, who became muster master general. That group essentially replaced the governing council with a council of war. The colonists did not take well to being forced to follow military leaders' demands without recourse, and the settlers withdrew into an essentially separate society. Minister Hope Sherrard often refused to give mass or sacraments to the governor or captains. Butler, according to Cupperman, came to feel that all resistance to his policies stemmed from secret cabals. The rift between Sherrard and Butler left the island splintered. Privateering, while not entirely unsuccessful, failed to solve the company's financial woes. Some privateers were captured while others struggled to find targets. In 1639, the investors quietly began setting up a mining concern on the coast in modern Panama. Unfortunately, the ship with those instructions was captured by Algerian pirates without ever reaching the Caribbean. Simultaneously, financial problems forced King Charles to call the Parliament for the first time in 11 years. As events began to move at home, the company even looked into selling the colony to the Dutch. When Butler left the island on February 24th, 1640, to confront the company, he left Andrew Carter in charge. Carter quickly made things worse. One colonist wrote that the land was daily up in arms, as Carter banished some, imprisoned others without alleging any cause. The Spanish, meanwhile, saw the island as a den of thieves and pirates that threatened the treasure fleets. The captain general of Cartagena convinced two generals of the Brazil fleet to act. A force of around 700 soldiers, plus seamen, arrived in May of 1640. Captain Carter, according to reports, proved himself a coward. The soldiers complained that he was ducking at every shot. As the Spanish landed, the forts fired upon them, causing significant hardship for the invaders. A cannon set up near the landing did good service, but thanks to Carter was ill provided, and the gunner had to spike the cannon. According to the counselors, there were only about 100 English to fight back, though the Spanish reported that there were more than 700 men, with a chief who was very experienced in war. At about 6 p.m. on May 30th, 300 Spanish landed, but they were fought off. Settlers later reported that only 2 of the attackers escaped injury or death. The counselors condemned Carter. At one point, they said he allowed the guns of a fort that hadn't even been attacked to be spiked, and the powder moved to where the women and children hid so that they might there die together. Carter seized food intended for the soldiers, putting some of it on a ship in the harbor. He fell on their victuals, the report read, and in the very heat of the fight showed his stomach, which was not to fight, but to feed. In the Thanksgiving feast that followed, the colonists attempted to replace Carter with their own appointed governor. Carter instead had Sherrard and others seized and sent back to England as prisoners. When the investors heard from them in 1641 that Carter had captured Spanish summarily executed, they sent an order to arrest him, it being a crime so heinous to the law of nature and nations that it ought not to escape without punishment. Even at this late stage, the company hoped to entice new people to immigrate. Throughout the life of the colony, they blamed disappointing letters from the island for the lack of interest, but the company also steadfastly refused to give the colonists any kind of representative government, even as other British colonies like Bermuda, Virginia, and Massachusetts Bay Colony were granted it. As they grew desperate, they offered those kinds of compromises to a series of ministers, all of whom would eventually decide not to go. They filled the need for workers with slaves. Samuel Risworth fought the use of slaves on moral grounds. This one more source of friction on the island. According to the company, buying enslaved Africans in the Caribbean was cheaper than sending servants, but came with a risk. In 1638, Providence Island suppressed the first slave rebellion in an English colony. Ultimately, the enslaved population would outnumber the English on the island. In 1641, when the island had only months left, they even successfully recruited colonists from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, more than 200 of them who would reach the island too late. They hoped at the end to start a new colony on the mainland that would bring in money better than the island ever did. The Spanish, however, were aware of the incoming colonists, and it may have inspired them to make another assault. General Francisco Diaz Pimienta, admiral of the treasure fleet, assembled a force under royal order to take the island. According to Copperman, he gathered 7 large ships and 4 pinnacles, manned by 1,400 soldiers and 600 seamen. They arrived off of Providence Island on May 19, 1641. This time he scouted carefully before attacking, and when bad weather prevented his preferred attack, he decided instead to strike the main harbor, believing the winds would bring his landing ships in faster than the English could deal with them. He attacked at dawn on May 24th. The attack was an immediate success, and the English were driven out of the hastily dug trenches and forced back to the nearest fort. Pimienta occupied the governor's house and moved to seize the rest of the island. When he saw the Spanish flag over the house, Carter surrendered. The island had been well defended, with 60 pieces of heavy artillery and considerable supplies for the planned colony on the mainland. Pimienta had been ordered to destroy the defenses, but he instead left a small force to defend the island. He was awarded the Order of Santiago for its capture. He showed the captured English mercy, killing none and eventually sending the women and children back to England. Other English ships arrived in the months that followed, but were chased off. The colony was officially dead. The investors would become distracted with the beginning of the English Civil War and the broader Wars of the Three Kingdoms, which started in 1642. But Oliver Cromwell's later Western design proved that the Puritans hadn't given up on the idea of a Puritan paradise in the Caribbean. The colony was never a financial success, and debt plagued the investors and their heirs for decades afterwards, although the island did eventually serve the English cause because the famed English privateer Henry Morgan seized the island twice later in the century. In 1670, he used it to raid Spanish Panama. Today, Ile de Providencia, which lies roughly midway between Costa Rica and Jamaica, is a municipality of the Colombian district of San Andres and Providencia. It's roughly 5,000 inhabitants, are a mix of descendants of enslaved Africans, English Puritan settlers, and Jamaican migrants. I hope you enjoyed watching this episode of The History Guy, and if you did, please feel free to like and subscribe and share The History Guy with your friends. And if you also believe that history deserves to be remembered, then you can support The History Guy as a member on YouTube, a supporter on our community at Locals, or as a patron on Patreon. You can also check out our great merchandise shop or book a special message from The History Guy on Cameo.